There is this perception that Solana suffers from these high transaction failures, especially during periods of peak demand. How much of that number is real?
Yeah, so right now, everyone, doesn't matter what user group or stakeholder is sending transactions to the network. It's based on an optimistic model. You send a transaction and then you hope for the best that it will be executed and included at the time you want it to, but you don't know.
But we know that in crypto, nothing is really 100%.
Spot on. There is never such a thing as 100% guarantee. Our job is to get to as close of a guarantee as we can possibly get. However,
with discussions around Solana's performance and decentralization heating up, Raiku is bringing new coordination layer that promises warranted block inclusion and predictable execution. So we are going to investigate what is behind it and how Raiku handles power dynamics in transaction ordering and what transparency, ethics, and long-term trust mean for Solana's ecosystem. Hi, Robin. Nice to have you here at CCN.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Shall we start with the first question? The first question goes into this 75% failure rate. So how bad is it really? There is this perception that Solana suffers from these high transaction failures, especially during periods of peak demand. So from your view inside the network, what's actually happening and how much of that number is real?
Yeah, so the number differs. So it can be anything from 5%, which usually refers to normal users. And what I mean by that is, simple transactions, swapping tokens or buying tokens. There it can be 5% failure rate, and that typically happens during congestion. But the number changes when you look at different user groups. So, for example, a user, which you can call, quote unquote, a sophisticated market player. So basically someone that is doing something that is not ordinary, and that can be high frequency trading or, similar types, such as, for example, a trading bot, etc. That number can be 45%, and in edge cases, even up to 90% failure rates. And this makes it very difficult for quote unquote sophisticated market players. And the issue is that, and it stems from this problem that right now, everyone, doesn't matter what user group or stakeholder is sending transactions to the network. It's based on an optimistic model. So you send a transaction and then you hope for the best that it will be executed and included at the time you want it to, but you don't know, right? So it's optimistic. Now, for the transaction senders who have, very specific needs on when this transaction should be executed, well, then they try again for this transaction to land as soon as possible, and that creates noise. And the more noise you also create, the more the network will be impacted, and thus the number of transactions which will fail goes higher and higher. And you can you can sort this by allowing transaction senders to approximate roughly when the transaction will be executed and included, by basically providing them a receipt that they can get ahead of time, such that they know they have space in a block whenever that block will be produced to exclusively include whatever the transaction sender sends them, such that they have this quote unquote guarantee, right? And that allows them to predict, to plan. So that's what we mean by transaction failures and solving that by the root, the core problem in itself.
I see. So at Raiku promises this warranted block inclusion, right? But we know that in crypto, nothing is really 100%. So what's the edge case where that warranty breaks? And how open or transparent are you when it does?
Spot on. There is never such a thing as 100% guarantee. However, you can certainly increase the probability of an event to happen, right? So there are edge cases for sure where a transaction from a transaction sender may not be included even though they already had this receipt. Now, there are multiple scenarios where these edge cases would look different, but it comes down to if the transaction is actually executed upon by the node operator themselves, the validator, and the validator may fail to include it, even though they may have promised it. And in some cases, it's not their fault. It can be issues with the client in itself, and its scheduler, etc. So there are certainly edge cases where a event may not happen, but our job is to decrease the probabilities of that happening, right? And then get to as close of a guarantee as we can possibly get.
Let's talk about this analogy of air traffic control or control tower. Who decides, which planes actually land first? How do you keep efficiency without turning Raiku into this gatekeeper on Solana?
This is a lovely question. I like it. So we refer to the Raiku node as a air traffic control center simply because it coordinates messages, but it is not the component that says who gets in and also who doesn't get in. This is simply something that is fully dedicated to the markets. So it is the market of reserving block space that decides. And here we run many different markets, and it is pretty much all down to will you win the bid or not, right? And that is what decides who gets in and not at any given time. And that is the same case today. So we're not really changing that. We're just increasing its efficiency, really.
Okay. I guess that has to do with a specific approach to decentralization, isn't it?
Yes. It depends on how you look at it. So you have the underlying network today. So let's say 100 nodes on Solana. It's way more than that, but let's say you have 100 nodes on the base network in itself. What Raiku does is that we work with those 100 nodes where these nodes would basically give a credible commitment or a promise that the product that the validator is basically producing, which is block space, they reserve a portion of that to then the wider application ecosystem of this base network where they can process that through Raiku. And what we're not changing the Nakamoto coefficient or the decentralized properties of the base network in itself. So that we're not doing. However, we are optimizing the transaction message passing and the latency of all those stages that includes wherever the transaction is being sent from. So basically the entire transaction pipeline from start to finish down to the base network, but we do not touch consensus and how that message is being propagated when that message basically has been confirmed by the validator and included, because then it is up to the base network in itself to propagate that message. So I would say when it comes to decentralization, we're not directly impacting the Nakamoto coefficient of Solana, the base network, but there could be indirect improvements where, for example, we make the revenue model or the prospect of running a validator more suitable for the node operator in itself, as in they can earn more money, and therefore you can see more validators being spun up. Or the other side of that is a base network like Solana has many nodes today. However, there are cases where the base network would be better positioned if the amount of nodes and where they are placed is optimized. So, for example, it's not just about the number, but where they are run and the stake that they are operating to have a decent say in the network. And Raiku could basically help improve that efficiency as well by aggregating certain inefficient node or nodes today to an efficient cluster. So we are impacting the decentralization part, but not directly. That's more of as a secondary effect.
Okay, so
if that made any sense.
Yes, I want to understand it. So actually, who do you think controls who controls the transaction order? And how does Raiku handle maximal extractable value? The priority fees, front running, and who checks that process? Because in the end, whoever controls the transaction actually holds the power, right? So what would you say?
So you have Solana today where certain nodes are extracting as much profit as they can by basically doing sandwich attacks. And that's not great for the user, or I would also say for the overall network. The reason why they do that is because the stake in which they require to operate the node to be profitable is very expensive. And then you got the operating cost of running the node in itself, which is also not cheap. So they're in a bit of a problem, right? Okay, so everything that I require in order to run this node is very, very expensive. Now, how can I then turn a profit? Well, sandwich attacks, not great. The other solution to that, which is close to what G2 is doing, is okay, and have been doing in the past, is then allowing searchers to construct and find the most rewarding bundles. And this also is within the topic of MAV. The problem with that is that you have many, many middlemen, right? Now, what Raiku is doing is that we're removing the middlemen completely, where the application or the transaction sender basically has an exclusive agreement directly down to the leader, the validator themselves, in order to get the priority, right? So you remove the middleman such that they will not extract this, MAV, because that is paid down directly to the validator themselves. And therefore you align the incentives across the different stakeholders such that you don't incentivize, harmful or toxic market dynamics. But I think the other part which is important about this is that the current market dynamics of MAV today and the overall transaction pipeline isn't legal in traditional markets, you could argue, because it's a bit of a shady business. Now, we also completely remove that such that you can operate as a more traditional business, let's say a hedge fund, etc., and you don't need to worry about that because now the MAV landscape as we have historically known it is solved because you have complete transparency over basically who gets in, because that isn't run through a middleman in itself. Did that answer your question?
Yes. So as I understand it, validators would integrate with Raiku, right? Do they depend on your system? What happens if Raiku actually goes down or is compromised?
Yeah. So, good question. Validators, they install a sidecar. Now, this sidecar allows communication between the Raiku node and the validator, right? And this sidecar doesn't really impact much at all the computational fingerprint of the validator in itself in the way they have historically run. And it also runs on the standard clients of the network today, being Agave and Fidancer, right? Now, if, let's say, the Raiku nodes go down, like all of them, there is no dependency on the Raiku node in itself in order for the network to work. The underlying network, Solana, will still be able to operate. The only impact it would have is that the marketplaces of AOT and JIT, which is the transaction types which allows for more sophisticated actions, right, by the transaction center and the applications, then that will be temporarily down. But normal transactions, the way the network basically operates today, would still continue to run. Now, so that's that. We don't really introduce any new dependencies to the network in itself on that, right? The probability of all the Raiku nodes going down is extremely small, and you can compare that to, for example, what is the assumptions that we have today on Bitcoin not being hacked, right? So unless an attacker takes over 51% of the network, that's not going to happen. So, right, it all comes down to the security assumptions. So nothing there is also really new. So the probability of that also happening is extremely low. So there's different ways of looking at it. But I think the most important thing is, will the underlying network be able to operate? Yes. Will users be able to still, access their funds and what they do today? Yes. Great.
And will actually the predictable execution work, especially with updates in Solana?
By that, what do you mean?
Solana upgrades often shift low-level behavior. So how do you make sure that Raiku's predictable execution still works after there are major upgrades on the network?
Ah, okay. I get you. So if there is any protocol updates on the network in itself, so basically the client, typically you know about this way ahead of time. So there is a repository on GitHub under Solana Foundation called Solana Improvement Documents. Now, we simply follow this, right, in order to make sure that we are up to date on the potential changes to the network in itself. But we also work with the core developers of the two core clients, being Agave, developed by Answer, and also Fidancer, developed by the Fidancer team and the wider Jump Crypto team. So that is how we ensure that whatever we build is, compatible with any potential change to the network. But we also built the overall, workflow internally to make sure that it is not a big undertaking to, adopt, for example, the sidecar to a new client version. And we've also built the sidecar in such a way that, again, it's fairly low touch and has fairly low fingerprint on the validator in itself. Is basically constructed in a lightweight fashion. So any major change that may come to the network in the future, it wouldn't take too long to adopt, essentially. So that's how we're approaching that.
Okay, great. So you've raised money from Pantera and others, and we know that big money shapes priorities, or it can shape priorities. So what's your main vision with Raiku, and what will you not compromise on, even under investors' pressure?
What will not be compromised on is underlying security and efficiency of the entire stack in itself, because you can't harm the users or the network, right? And that can obviously mean many, many different things. But in most cases, it means you always need to balance your approach with the stakeholders in which you serve, right? And we serve many stakeholders. And that's a constant battle that you always need to deal with. I'm not sure if that was a good answer, but basically the integrity of the network in itself and hence its users, that's always top priority. Now, when it comes to the overall vision of Raiku, we want to make on-chain primitives as accessible as they can be, in order to provide access to opportunity that I think decentralized systems as infrastructure rails for trade, economy, whatever, can actually work. And what that means is it has to be equivalent or better to the options that we have today. Right. And we worked on crypto for 10 years. We've come a far way, but I think we still got quite a bit to do. Mm-hmm. The good thing is we've tested so many design principles and, ideas. So I do think we have the answer on what we really need to do in order to make these networks as equivalent or better when it comes to accessibility, performance, scalability, all of these wonderful things. But we need to approach the constructions of these networks a bit differently, because we've thought about these networks. Yeah, go for it.
No. Please finish.
No, I was just saying we've thought about these networks first as, one monolithic base network. So, for example, Ethereum, Solana, Aptos, Sui. Especially in Ethereum, because it made a lot of sense at this time and still does. Then we started to add like secondary systems, so L2s, etc. Now that led to many, many different problems, such as information fragmentation, user experience issues, and stuff like that. However, we do know that off-chain components are basically components that is closer to the user and more within the control of the application itself. Makes a lot of sense, because it allows the application to control more underlying business logic and also process things faster. However, you need to do that in such a way that you don't hurt the underlying base network, the engine that runs it all, right? And what we're doing at Raiku is essentially allowing for that to happen without hurting the network. So basically avoiding information fragmentation, etc. But also at the same time making the developer experience as smooth as it possibly can be. Because it's already too hard today to make an application, because there is so many different avenues you can go down. You want to give developers and users a streamlined way of executing on whatever they need, right? And that's what we're doing.
Great. But that takes me to almost my last question. So you say you have all of this experience, working on these networks, and that you probably have the answers, right, to many of the problems that might arise. So is there any technical or any ethical risk that makes you feel that hasn't been solved, that keeps you awake at night?
Oh, always. Always. There's always questions that there is, no full answer to, which is the most exciting part. Of course there is. So when it comes to, for example, the marketplaces, here, as you are dealing with low-level fee markets of Solana, the base network in itself, things become political very quickly. You need to be careful, right? To your question earlier, who gets prioritized and why? And the other side of that question is then, well, who ends up not getting prioritized, right? It all comes down to design decisions, which will have a far-reaching impact on the end user, and that needs to be thought through properly, because that's a big responsibility, right? And we certainly don't think that we know the best and have the full answer to what this would be. So you constantly need to work with, the ecosystem actors, many different stakeholders, which comes down to the developers, but also the core developers of the network, the validators, because it's an entire economy, right? And a very simple decision that, looks relatively simple at the time, may not be, because again, it has so many secondary effects, later on. And so that is certainly, something that keeps me awake, and also the wider team.
Well, it is kind of what keeps us all awake and going, right? In this world of tech and crypto, it's just going to be always full of challenges and things to solve and understand and fix, which makes it exciting in the end, I suppose.
Yes.
Is there anything, Robin, that you would like to add to this interview before we say goodbye?
Yes, we're hiring. We always hire. So please check the open jobs that we have at Raiku.com.
Okay. Well, thank you, Robin, so much for joining us today at CCN. This is Robin, CEO of Raiku, and I'm Dr. Lorena Nessi for CCN. So thank you for watching, and see you next time.